Hi friends, welcome back. So today I have a new painting that I want to show you. I've actually finished it at the time of recording this intro, and it is one of my favorite things that I have ever painted. I love it. I got some new higher quality canvases this year, and this was the first time that I've had opportunity to paint on them because I've been making myself go through my lesser quality ones before I move on to my nice ones. And this is also, I think, the biggest painting I've ever done. I had such a fun time doing this one. I did film the majority of it. There is a animal on it that I didn't film the recording of that part because I knew it was going to be a lot and I didn't want the pressure of doing it on camera. But I got most of the rest of it, and I think you guys are really going to like it. So let's hang out for a little while and I will show you all of the steps that I did in making this new painting. Let's go. So I did a bunch of techniques on this painting that I'm not sure if I've ever actually shown in videos before. So that also made this one really fun to do because I really wanted to show you guys specifically how I do this kind of sky. I basically have, I believe I have 4 different colors on my palette, and I start by applying very, very wet paint with an angle brush in just little blobs like this. And then I switch to a mop brush, just like I believe it's a 1/2 inch mop brush. And I just blend all of those colors together. And by doing that, I end up with very specifically what looks a lot like a very natural night sky. I haven't tried it a whole lot with daytime colors, but whenever I want to do a night sky, this is my go-to. And it always comes out really well. It always comes out well on the first try. I almost never have to go over it. It just comes out really, really pretty. And one of the keys is to knowing when to apply your lights and when to apply your darks. And interestingly enough, that's something that I'm good at from doing my eyeshadow. I'm pretty good about knowing, okay, here I need to have a light color, here I need to have a dark color, and I literally attribute that to just doing my fun eye makeup colors for the majority of my life. But as you can see, this is actually coming together pretty quickly. I believe that the sky took about 20 to 30 minutes total. It is one of the quicker techniques, and that also makes it really nice because I can get a lot of canvas covered really quickly. And it's one of those techniques that once you figure it out, you just want to keep doing it. I really enjoy doing this technique. I've used it probably 4 or 5 times at this point, and it always comes out nice. It always comes out differently, and depending on what colors you pick, it'll be totally different every time you do it. Also depends on like what brush you use for that initial color laydown. And then if you use a larger brush, a larger mop brush for blending everything together, you will end up with a different texture than if you use the smaller one like this. Which I think it's just a fun technique to do. You get some nice color variation without having to put in an intense level of detail and attention, which as always is one of my favorites, especially when you're having to cover a lot of canvas like in this piece. I'm trying to cover a lot of ground with a few colors, and I'm trying to keep it to kind of a minimum amount of paint. I don't want it to be super thick. I would ideally want to keep these colors relatively thin on the canvas. I like having a little bit of that white able to pop through. Not a lot of it, obviously, but when you're doing a sky like this, I do think that it makes sense to have a little bit of that canvas color show through. I did gesso this canvas too before I started. It was white on white, so that didn't feel like a thing I needed to film. Basically, like I said, I got some new canvases. This is one of them, and this is my first time using one. I had gotten them a few months ago now. They were on sale at the store where I get my canvases, and I had gone back and forth for a while on whether I wanted to get really nice ones or just get the same ones I had been getting because I was happy with those. And ultimately, I decided to splurge a bit and get some really nice canvases, and I am so happy with that. These are fabulous canvases. They take paint super nicely. I really like having, there's about a 1.5 inch edge that's fully paintable. The corners are super crisp. It's just really high quality, really, really nice, and I'm super happy that I ended up splurging on it. But I still had some of my old canvases left, so I was trying to make myself go through a bunch of those before I actually tried one of the new canvases. I didn't make it. I still have a few of the old ones left, but I need to try a new canvas. I just needed to. So here I'm adding basically a suggestion that there's trees in the background. This should just look like a canopy that you're seeing in the distance. The foreground is going to be a hill that'll have more detail on it. But for the background, I didn't want it to just be sky butting up against a grassy hill. I wanted to have some sort of transition between the two, and I really like doing this where I'm using that same 1/2 inch mop brush, and I'm just tapping in layers of greens and teals and aquas to give the impression of there being trees back there without having to do, again, just a whole lot of detail in an area that doesn't need it. One of the biggest pieces of advice that has really stuck with me over the years is when you are painting something like this, when you're working on the background, you don't need to focus on doing the details. You really need to think about shapes more than details at this stage. So I'm spending a lot of time going back and forth between those two colors here. And then I did change the camera angle. I started to film this with the same camera angle and it just didn't look as good. Since we're closer up on the bottom section of the canvas now, I thought it made more sense to just zoom in on this bit. So this is the first layer of paint that I'm doing for that grassy hill that I talked about. And this layer is the layer that looks bad, basically. That's what I always have to remind myself when I am doing this bottom coat, is that this layer is basically a skin of paint. It doesn't have to look perfect. It's not going to look perfect. It's going to look a little blotchy. It's going to look a little sloppy. And that's fine because this is essentially the undercoat. Some of this paint will show through. Most of this paint will not. For the most part, all of this paint will get covered with other colors. And that's the thing I have to constantly remind myself when I'm working on a new painting like this and when I'm working on specifically covering white. This stage just doesn't look good. And there's always a stage that doesn't look good, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with there being an ugly stage, as it were. And honestly, I don't even think that this looks ugly. It just looks blotchy and unfinished. I wouldn't stoop so low as to call this ugly. If you're ever painting and you get to this stage and you just look at it and you think it looks bad, just remember that it doesn't look bad. it looks unfinished. So I'm taking 3 different colors. I have a deep teal, a viridian green, and a phthalo green. And I'm just kind of blending them together, and I'm adding a lot of water in this stage too, which is why it gets pretty blotchy. And once that dries, I'm going in with this emerald green, and then Japanesque pale green and aqua blue. Aqua green, sorry. And this is, again, this is a nighttime scene. So this is moonlight hitting the grass. And so I'm going to go back and forth with some of these colors and kind of lighten some areas, darken some areas, but this is where you can see that not all of that original layer of paint is going to be what you see. Again, when I'm doing areas like this, I want there to be some differential in color. I don't want it to be a flat color. If you have some of that texture and some of that color variation, it just looks a lot more natural and a lot more realistic. So I try really hard to lean into having that variation in color and having that, it's not blotchy necessarily. It's not blotchy. It's more streaky, and I don't know if streaky is the right word either. It's more natural because the light isn't going to hit every spot the way that you think it will. Even if you go outside right now in the dark and you see some areas that are lit by the moon, it's not going to be lit in the way that you would necessarily expect. There's always going to be some areas that are lit and some areas that are dark that are not exactly what you would have anticipated to be in the dark or in the light. And that's one of the things that I try to play with when I'm doing especially a big section of canvas like this. I try to keep it to where I have a really natural and really almost sporadic method of showing like where the light is hitting. I don't have the moon depicted in this painting at all, but in my head the moon is off to the upper right of the canvas. So I'm trying to bear that in mind as I go, and then I'm thinking about where I have the highs and lows in the canvas and what areas I think the moonlight would be hitting the most. And then I'm trying to create this cool tealy pale green color to be that section that is highlighted. And here you'll see the reason why I didn't do much for highlight in this upper section over here is because I have this giant tree, and if there's a big tree here, then the sections under it will not be getting as much light. You can also see that I did, between these two sections, take a quick off-camera break and sketched out my tree. I use white graphite pencils for this, especially on gouache. They work so well. If I'm doing a lighter colored canvas, I will use just a traditional pencil, but for pieces where there's more dark tones and colors where that standard gray lead color is not going to show up, white graphite pencils. I don't remember who first recommended that to me, but that was a huge win. I just get them off Amazon if you're ever in the need. I really like doing these really big twisty trunk trees. I don't do them a whole lot. I try to not be too overwhelming with the number of these trees that I do. They are one of my favorite trees to do. I like how much movement they have in the trunk. I like painting them. They're just really fun to paint. But it's one of those that, because it's one of my favorites, I try not to overdo it. Which is funny because then with that sky technique, I'm like, I'm going to do that as often as I possibly can. So here I'm using a chocolate brown and a raw umber. And I'm just kind of going back and forth between the two colors, highlighting some sections with the umber and bringing it down with the chocolate. The chocolate is this slightly redder color, which is the main color that I want it to be. I want the umber to be kind of the accent tone. I love when I'm doing one of these really big canvases, just having one big focal point, in this case the tree. And my intention when I was working on this piece was to only have there be one tree that was fully in detail, and then just having those suggestions of trees in the background. I didn't want to have any other trees. I had plans of doing some bushes and some rocks, but trying to keep your attention solely on this tree. Here I'm adding some pale green just to give, again, that idea of moonlight hitting the tree trunk. I really like when you get that really pale greeny bluey color on pretty much everything from the moonlight. I like that the moon doesn't really give off white or yellow light. It almost gives off a blue light. And that's really fun to paint. So I started with my tree highlights, just working on highlighting with that green color, and then pulling it back by adding a little bit of water and then some more of the brown to make it just an accent and not too bold, because you could see when I first put it on there it was too bold. But the nice thing with gouache is that you can really pull that color back down by just adding some water before it dries. This is also one of the ways that I make sure you notice the tree trunk is a twisted tree trunk, is by adding in that little accent, that little highlight color. If you don't have that, it is really easy for that twisty tree trunk look to just disappear, which in this case was not what I wanted. There are some cases where I don't want it to be super obvious, but this one, because the tree is going to be one of the big focal points, I did want it to be pretty obvious that it was a twisty trunk tree. So I spend a decent amount of time just on those highlights, and then I'm going to come in with that same 1/2 inch mop brush that I did the background and those background trees with. And I'm going to do basically the same technique that I did with those trees in the background. And I'm just going back and forth with 3 or 4 different colors, and I'm just patting the canvas and adding in suggestions of where the leaves are. From here, I am going back in with some brighter greens to add my signature glowing moss. This has become one of the things that if I don't put it on the trees in this series, it just doesn't look right. Something about it just looks, for lack of a better word, wrong. It just looks wrong. So I have 3 or 4 different colors again that I will go back and forth with for this. One of the main ones is aqua green and then Japanesque pale green. I also sometimes will add in a little bit of lime green just to give it that little bit of a glowy punch. But this, I think, adds that really nice, almost like tree trunk texture to the tree, just by it having this glowing moss. Again, it's just one of those details that I've started doing in this series a lot, and it just needs it. It just needs that little magical touch of glowing moss. being that I don't have a whole lot of magical elements in this particular painting, I think adding this detail was really key to making it fit in the series. When I started this series, it was actually supposed to be just foxes and fairies, but over time it has really evolved into having a bunch of different animals, and this is one of those. It will not be a fox, and there will be no fairy, but it's in the same series. Which basically means I need to think of a new name for it, because it was originally The Fox and the Fairy. Here I'm just adding some finishing touches to that moss. Just getting it to the shape and texture and color that I want and that really fits in with the rest of the series. I tend to forget that it should come off the tree a little bit, so it doesn't need to fit exactly onto the tree. It should be a little bit off. Oh, and here is where I'm about to have a crisis on this painting. I wanted to add some little bushes. This was the first one that I was doing, and this one came out fine. I did end up keeping it. It's fine. It's a nice little bush. And then I decided that I was going to do another one farther up on the canvas, and I just shouldn't have. If I wanted to keep this painting how I wanted it. In the end, I'm actually really happy with how this came out, but I didn't have my compression glove on because I've been trying to paint without it. And right about here, I dropped my brush. It was not great. I got paint on the carpet, but we took a break and we came back to it. I did hit the canvas with the brush. It is hard to see where the accident was from this angle, but there was a paint smear, and I basically didn't have another option but to add this additional little tree, which this wasn't part of the plan. My plan was to have the only tree be that really big twisted trunk tree. And like I said, by the end of this piece, I am happy with how it looks. This is honestly one of my favorites. But in the moment, it was really, really hard to have to cover a paint smear with a tree that I didn't want to have there in the first place. I sent photos to I don't know how many different friends to check and see how it looked and if they liked it, because I didn't like it at this point. I didn't like that it had a paint smear. I didn't like that I had to add this tree. It was really, really difficult for me in this moment. The worst part of it being that had I been wearing my compression glove, I probably would have been fine. But again, I've been trying to not have to wear it. I've been going in 20 to 30 minute bursts without wearing it. And that's what I was in when this incident happened. Not ideal, but in the end it came out okay. So again, I've added my little tree, and now I'm going back in with that green moss. Yet again, I just think that if I don't have this on there, it just doesn't look right. Even on the little trees, it's necessary. It just needs that little touch of glowing moss. In the moment, I also thought that it might kind of help to detract from the fact that this tree wasn't supposed to be there. And then I had this dilemma of, okay, well, I've already painted this bush back here. Do I just pretend that it's part of the tree? When I first started adding in the leaves, I was trying to not have that bush be part of the tree. I was trying to make it its own thing. and within a couple of minutes I just gave up, and that bush is now no more. It is part of a tree. By the time we get to about here, I'm more okay with this little tree being in the area. He's not too intrusive. He's not what I wanted. It's not the super clean look that I was going for with this piece. But it did come out nicely, and I'm not unhappy with how it looks anymore. I did take, I think I took 2 days off after having to paint that tree, just because I didn't love the way that it had come out. So now I'm just going in and I am adding more detail to the ground. This section I started to paint in a little bit of a darker color, and it got away from me, and I ended up putting this little extra hill in the front, which again was not really what I was going for, but by the time it was in, I actually really liked that. I think it kind of helped to differentiate and add some additional layers to the piece. And then there were a couple of sections that I wasn't thrilled with, so I decided to add some rocks, which I don't paint a ton because while I like my rocks, they can take a while to paint, and sometimes a lot of the time I just don't feel like it. So on this one, when I stepped back and looked at it, I knew that this was what it needed. It needed some rocks to kind of ground it in space and make it really work with the rest of the composition. It needed something to, I don't know, tie it together, I guess. So I spent a while, they are sketched in, all of them, but I think I sketched them so lightly that you can't really see them in this camera angle. But I spent a little while sketching in a few different rocks and kind of going back and forth on deciding where I wanted them. The character that I'll be painting is going to go pretty much smack dab in the middle of that light section in the middle of the grass. So I don't want to add any rocks there, but I do want to add some around it to kind of frame the piece a little bit. And then, of course, I haven't added in like little grasses and little plants yet, but we will get there. I probably spent another hour or so just doing rocks. This piece honestly took a really long time. I think I mentioned at the start of this video that it's one of the biggest canvases I have. In fact, I think it is the biggest canvas I've ever done. When I was ordering my canvases, I didn't think to go measure what sizes I'd done before. I just picked sizes that I thought would be good. And I like all of the sizes that I picked out, but some of them are bigger than what I'm used to, which really just means that they're going to take me a little bit more time, but I'll be able to get a lot more detail and a lot more stuff, a lot more elements into each piece, which I really like. I like having the space to be able to add a lot of different details into a piece. While I really like doing the smaller pieces that have more of a focus on one or two specific things, I think that it's really nice to do a bigger piece where you can have multiple elements that can draw your focus over time, where there'll be one central element that'll really draw your attention, but then there'll be several smaller elements that will draw your attention after that. And that's one of the things that I think is a lot easier to do with a bigger canvas. And then for me personally, I really like big art. I do some small pieces. I'm still working on some of those mini canvases for when my website goes up, but There's just something about doing a really big piece. I like doing the mini canvases as study pieces, so those are a good way for me to practice new animals, practice rocks, practice trees, practice grass. But in the end, those are just practice pieces, and the big piece is the finale almost. It's almost like the mini canvases are the warm-up, and then the large canvas is the main event. Which again is why I think it'll be really fun to have the mini canvases on my website, because then you guys can see some of the studies for the big pieces that I do. I know I haven't really done a whole lot of videos to show you the mini canvases, but I should have one coming up soon. I think I'll make some time to do that because those are really fun. I do enjoy doing the mini canvases. It is really fun to get out of my comfort zone and paint a different size and a different style than I ordinarily would. I hope that you guys really like those too, because those are a really fun addition to the collection. So this is my last rock up here. And as you can see, they do just take a while to do. It's black, white, and brown, but there's just a lot of going back and forth with your paint colors. And you really have to think about what rocks look like, which isn't necessarily what you think of in your head as rocks looking like. In the end, I really like how all of them came out, but it was kind of a hassle to paint a bunch of rocks. And here I am just adding shadows and depth, and I'm starting to work on the little grasses that will kind of ground everything. Up to this point, everything is just kind of sitting on this glassy field of grass, and if you don't take the time to add in plant-shaped details and things to really ground all of your elements into your background, it can look a little fake. So up until this point, the tree just kind of looked like it was sitting there. It wasn't really rooted in the ground. And just by taking the time to add these little grasses and add some shading on the roots, add this little bit of detail that just shows that it's not just sitting there, it does actually belong here. There is grass and plant life that has grown up around all of these roots over time. That's one of the elements that can really, really make a painting come to life. And it's at this point that I start to have a lot of fun, because I am getting close. I'm getting toward the end. I will usually add the majority of my finishing touches before I add a character, especially if I'm doing a painting like this where there's not really anything else that's going to be around that character. He's just going to be sitting in the middle of this field looking up at the stars. And because of that, I don't need to put him in and then paint around him. I can paint everything else in place and add him in a minute. So the area that I spend the most time around is definitely the tree, because again, that's the biggest element on the canvas, and it needs to fit. It needs to be grounded, it needs to be rooted, it needs to look like it belongs on this canvas. And honestly, just by adding those grassy details, it does. It looks like this is where it belongs. And now I'm just doing that same thing around the rocks. I am just adding some little grasses, a little bit of green under them to give them a little bit of shadow. And again, that just grounds them. It shows that they do have a space because the moonlight is hitting the rock and there is a little shadow. And it's one of those details that is easily missed if you're not paying attention to where your light source is. So especially on a piece like this, I do have to continually remind myself of where the light is coming from and where I need to have dark and where I need to have light. This rock in the front really gave me a hard time. I kept just oopsing while I was painting, and I did eventually, as you can see here, have to pull the canvas forward so that I could paint it a little bit more easily. I had to do this a bunch, actually. I cut most of those spots out of the video, but I wanted to show you at least one of them. It just, I think because the canvas is so big and because I had the camera there, I had a challenge painting around that rock for whatever reason. But so here again, just adding those little grassy details, adding little plant lives, just making it very clear that this is a nature setting and it's not water, I guess. Sometimes the kind of glassy grass can look a little too watery for me. So here we're just adding one last little planty dude. If you know me and you know my paintings, I have to have one of these plants somewhere. I really like this brush stroke. I really like these little plants. And I had to have one. I just had to. Them's the rules. And yeah, just final details and making it exactly how I wanted before we get to the end. I did end up taking about a 20-minute break after finishing all these details before I had the gumption to paint the character. Because again, it is one I had never painted before and he was a challenge. And ready or not, guys, here he comes. Here is the final canvas. I did end up painting a shooting star up at the top, which I draw your attention to so that you understand that our little friend, our little badger friend, is making a wish on a shooting star. He was a lot of fun to paint, but he was very much a challenge to paint. But this was a really fun painting, and I hope that you guys enjoyed watching me. I will see you next week with a whole new one. Bye, guys.